Well, that went smoothly. I'm glad you got to see one song. That's really terrific. I wanted to play the opening of A Space Odyssey, which both of the songs obviously is a way to launch us into this evening's program. And we were having a bit of a problem with technology, but I think you got the point. I think maybe you do remember 2001, A Space Odyssey, and that movie really came out, I believe, in the 1980s, and we still, the whole idea of space was still a mystery to us. And for those of us who grew up with Buck Rogers, the whole idea of any of this, 2001 and the 1980s seemed like anything was possible, that there would be howls in the sky talking to us and so forth. But we have come a long, long way since our childhood with Buck Rogers. I'm currently in a space capsule right now, if you can see it. If you go into speaker view, you'll see everything easier. I'm actually in a mock space capsule that's somewhere in the desert in the United States. And what is growing is a garden. It looks like a garden. If I got up from my chair and walked backward, you would think I'm actually walking into a garden. If I lean over, you can see close up, there's a door. You can look out the window and there's an American flag. And this is a simulated, a space capsule that would go to Mars when people go to Mars to form a colony. And we already know that the astronauts going out for 6 months and longer don't want to take a lot of moon cheese with them and moon ice cream. They can't spend 6 months to a year eating that. So they figured out, one of the great experiments was to figure out how to grow food in space, real food, as in produce. And that's what this is. The seeds, the plants will reproduce seeds. There's a moisture technology to this that will continue to produce moisture, enough moisture to grow these plants. It's all, of course, going to be a controlled environment. And that's the future. People going to Mars are going to be eating this. It's very exciting. So we've even come a long way from landing on the moon 50 years ago, where we hit a golf ball off the moon and we thought that was really cool. And little did we know that that golf ball was going to be the start of space debris. Which is a major topic of our program this evening. And it's more than just littering the universe. It's become very serious. And we have a wonderful a panel of experts to talk about that this evening. Space travel is very romantic. We thought nothing could go wrong until something went very wrong. And we all witnessed it when the Challenger went up and just blew up. And it had set us back. We didn't expect that. I guess we thought that this was such a magical golden adventure that nothing like this could happen, that the technology was going to be so perfect and so good. And it happened. And I think the luster went off quite a bit on space travel until just recently, and the idea of the Mars exploration. But I think probably one of the things too has been the commercial pursuits that we saw last summer. We may not necessarily have liked all the characters in these pursuits, but it's certainly fascinated people to tune in. And I think everybody held their breath while they took off of these rockets they made themselves, working, of course, closely with NASA. They couldn't have done it all by themselves. And they came back and they only went to the edge of the Earth, but they saw a sight that I think all of us would love to see. Some of us, I got claustrophobia, so I'd never get in one of those things. So I'll just imagine what it looks like. But it has relaunched and reignited imagination. But more than just, are we going to do it just to have space travel? It's reignited the imagination of what is possible and what space exploration brings us. It just doesn't bring us, Buck Rogers, in real life. It brings us all kinds of research and technology that's extremely important to us here on Earth. And that's going to be talked about this evening as well. So it's very, very exciting. Now I've got some suggestions here that some of the things that are possible. I mean, there's a lot of debris out there, but amidst the debris, and the debris is by thousands of satellites now, not just one Telstar spinning around the Earth or a Sputnik, but thousands of satellites in each of the constellations, which there are many. There's the concern with the debris, of course, is in-orbit collisions, radio frequency congestion. We worry about getting on a plane, being told to turn off your cell phones. Well, imagine the radio frequency congestion, control and abuse of personal data, influence and national political affairs, the light pollution, even in the sky, is affecting now in some of our cities. But there's also some very good things that will impact climate change, ocean pollution, track illegal fishing, control smuggling, and even help with the spread of pandemics. So there's hope once again, and we're going to be talking about that. And I want to introduce our speakers. I've known Joe Pelton. Where is Dr. Joe Pelton? He's here in the room. I have known him. He's waved out there. I've known Joe for decades. We go back a long ways. He's the chairman. Now, each of our panel, these are profound experts. They have very long bios. So what I'm reading is going to be very brief. Currently is the chairman of the Alliance for Collaboration and the Exploration of Space, called ACES Worldwide. He's the former dean and chairman of the board of the International Space University with its main campus in Strasbourg, France, and is a full member of the International Academy of Astronautics. He is the award-winning author and editor of over 50 books and 300 articles in the field of telecommunications and networking, space systems, future technologies, and urban planning. His book, Global Talk, won a Pulitzer Prize nomination, and he's also the founder of the Arthur Clarke Foundation. Now, Arthur Clarke, if I've been able to play the video, you might remember, was a major contributor to 2001, A Space Odyssey, and I always thought that was so cool. He and Arthur Clarke were very good friends. And of course, you may have gone to the film if you're old enough, as he had co-written the screenplay for that. Professor Ron Jakhu, can you please raise your hand and show us where you are? Is a full professor at Faculty of Law and acting director, Institute of Air and Space Law at McGill University. He served as director of the Institute of Air and Space Law. He's a faculty member and first director of the Master of Space Studies program, also at the International Space University in Strasbourg, and a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Space Security. In 2016, Professor Jakhu received the Leonardo da Vinci Lifelong Achievement Award from the International Association for the Advancement of Space Safety, and in 2007, the Distinguished Service Award from the International Institute of Space Law for significant contribution to the development of space law. And our last panelist is Professor Carolin Freuh, who holds a PhD. Carolin, where are you? You can wave. I know you're good. There you are. In physics, with a specialization in astronomy from the University of Bern, Switzerland. She was a National Research Council postdoc with Air Force Research Laboratory, Kirtland Air Force Base, and a research scientist with the Aerospace Department at Texas A&M. She is currently an associate professor at Purdue University. And if you didn't know this, Purdue University has been called the cradle of astronauts because it's produced a lot of astronauts, and they are very proud of that. And those of us who are alumni can say we are very proud of that. She's with the Aeronautics and Astronautics Department. Since 2018, Dr. Freuh is the chair of the COSPAR panel on potentially environmental detrimental activities in space. Research interests are space situational awareness, object characterization and astrodynamics, sensor fusion and overall retrieval in data-deprived regions, guidance and control. I'm an historian, I'm a humanities major, Carolin, so I'm going to ask our panel, you may have to explain some of these things to us as we're going along. She's also published more than 100 research papers. In my angst about not being able to play that Space Odyssey, for those of you who are all now in the room, welcome to the Carl Gayweiler Great Decisions Program. This is on the new space race for 2022. And because we have a panel, we were anxious to really just dive right in. The first part of the program is going to be asking questions. And then we're going to be moderating it. We're going to be doing the public Q&A. We will be doing it as we always did. We're going to ask that you be muted while the panel speaks, please. And we'll just be focusing on the panel. When we do the public Q&A, we'll go back to a full gallery view, just as though we're in the audience. And you can either ask your own question, or you can submit your question to Ray Montano, who will read it for you. But we really do encourage you to ask your own question. We miss that from our being live, which we hope to be again next program year, 2022, 2023, having that interactive engagement. But let's start with the first question. And that is, how serious is the competition between the US and China and Russia when it comes to competitive space stations, new types of space weaponry, and plans for competitive missions to the South Pole of the Moon during the decade of the 2020s? And I'll start with Dr. Pelton.
Good evening. The one thing you didn't mention in your introduction to me is that the highlight of my career was playing table tennis with Arthur C. Clarke in Sri Lanka.
Well, you didn't have it in your bio. Did I miss that?
Anyway, good evening. Let's go back in time when the US and even the Soviet Union and Russia were good friends in space. In 1987, there was the 30th year anniversary of the launch of Sputnik. And at that time, there were more than 30 astronauts and cosmonauts together in Star City, just outside of Moscow, celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Sputnik launch and planning to go ahead with cooperation in the Mir space station, which at that time was considered phase one of the International Space University. In fact, maybe we can show that slide of the International Space Station that was put up by joint launches from the US and from the shuttle. And many of the components were built either by Russia and by the United States. And there was a long period from certainly 87 on, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the start of Russia being the prime leader in the late 80s and into the 90s. There was enormous cooperation between the US and Russia, and they basically joined together to put up the International Space Station. And Russia is still a partner in that, even though things started to change about 5 years ago. And this is when the US proceeded with its Artemis program to put a space station on the southern part of the moon under what was called the Artemis program. And at that time, China, which was not allowed to be a partner in the International Space Station, and was also not allowed to partner with Europe in terms of its own space navigation system. Then there was, if you will, always sort of China looking in to the world space community and doing it on their own. But in the last 5 years, there has been a growing partnership between China and Russia. They're putting a space station on the southern part of the moon in competition with the US Artemis program. They've agreed to do that as a joint project between Russia and China. And they've also agreed to have a orbiting space station around the moon together, and also a joint project to send a probe to an asteroid. So the world has changed, and Russia has sent an announcement some time ago that they would end their cooperation in the space station and launch their own, and that they would end their participation as of 2025. And it sounds as if that may now, in light of the conflict in Ukraine, that this may end sooner. The head of Roscosmos, which is the Russian space agency, Mr. Rogozin, has recently put out an announcement and saying, Mr. Biden, do you realize it's Russian boosters that maintains the International Space Station in its orbit, and without our participation and our boosters, the space station could actually decline in orbit and crash into Earth. And that was not a very welcome statement to hear from our partners in the International Space Station, but that happened last week. So there's much more that I can say, but the bottom line is that China and Russia are now seemingly close partners in many different space projects, and Russia is pulling out of the International Space Station.
Yeah, I think that during our audience Q&A, that there may be more discussion of that. I'm going to anticipate there'll be more questions. I'm going to go on to the second question. This is for.
Oh, can I still insert something?
Absolutely, yes.
Sorry, I just wanted to say, as your question also had a weaponization of space as part of the question, and I think it's good, kind of in the same line what kind of Joe said, to keep in mind we had the history of anti-satellite tests kind of in the Cold War era, and then there was a relative years of tranquility on that, and then 2007, we had the Chinese anti-satellite test of the Fanyong, which was stupidly high, 850 kilometers, 3,000 pieces of debris. Then 2008, US had an anti-satellite test, but which was also motivated, not causing harm on Earth, and was very low. Only 2 pieces were left in orbit after a week. India 2019, and then of course 2021 in November, just recently, the Russian anti-satellite test. So we also see how space is kind of playing into that military muscle play, and yeah, that also has picked up in recent years, again after a period of relative tranquility after the Cold War era.
Thank you.
I would just like to add that there is a group called the Secure World Foundation that recently put out a report on what is called counter space activities. And it shows essentially all of the different capabilities that exist. And that, again, it's the US, Russia, and China that have the most sophisticated capabilities to do various things in that regard. And that I am personally working with the ACES group that I am involved with to try to develop better standards for what are called rendezvous and proximity operations in space, because there are very major concerns about this, both in the commercial world and certainly in the military and defense world, as well as other standards about what can be done in space. And I know that Dr. Jakhu also did a study on sort of nomenclature and trying to get the word usage so there's no misunderstanding when people refer to military or defense activities in space, that they get the wrong message.
I'd like to direct the next question to Professor Jakhu. Thanks for bringing up his name. I guess it would go directly into that. Professor Jakhu, can these competing, as we're discussing, can these competing interests in space be solved by updating the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 and the other more focused international agreements that followed related to the safety of astronauts, registration of objects launched into space, liability for object launched into space, and the so-called Moon Treaty that relates to the moon and all astronomical bodies? It's a long question, but your thoughts, please. You're muted.
Sorry, technologies. I want to thank you very much for inviting me to share my thoughts on that. And I think it's good, the discussion of whatever I saw, that it's my response fits very much there. I think we have seen cooperation and then competition, what is building in that way. But all those things we should keep, even what is happening in space is actually a reflection of what we have on Earth. Earth cannot be different from space, and space cannot be different from Earth. So we need to look at how we can learn to, we mean these nations or people can learn to live together and taking advantage of all the things that you outlined earlier. So it is, so all that can be achieved, at least from my perspective, only, and I use the word only specifically, under rule of law. If there's no rule of law, minor differences becomes major problems. You just imagine you're going on a major highway. Everybody is allowed to do whatever he or she wants to do. What will happen? So rule of law is perhaps the most important thing we should keep in mind. And that is determined by nations with the participation with people, that. So what is really is, if we have seen some turmoils, and nowadays is a really more serious problem we are having with respect to Ukraine and canceling the International Space Station Agreement and all those kind of things are there. But from 1957, during Cold War period, till today, why didn't we see major problems space? Not really serious major problems here, simply because we have some rules of law which countries have felt bound by them. They followed them. The other thing is that there was a number was small. Now number is increasing, number of factors and activities. That means when you have few cars in the road, you need rudimentary rules. Drive on the right-hand side, stop at the stop sign and go, right? When there are too many cars, then you need a little bit more sophisticated rules and a monitoring and the punishment. So that brings me to the point that you mentioned earlier. So Outer Space Treaty, by the way, you may not know, US played a significant, important role in the development of that treaty. And US was a pioneer in the development of space law. So that we should not forget. So that treaty is, I think, I believe is a foundational treaty. People like to call it's outdated. No, it is not outdated. It is becoming inadequate because the things have changed. The new actors, new players, and new activities. That it need to be supplemented. That is, you write at a very, you said it correctly. It has been supplemented by 4 other treaties. It needs to be supplemented further as things are evolving. Now, I'll come back to the point later on that, how it should be done. The other thing is, these are, by the way, these are 5 treaties. Normally, people talk about there are only 4 treaties. They always forget that there's a Moon Treaty or Moon Agreement. I'm glad that you mentioned that word, Moon Treaty. And even in space law community, they think to see 4 treaties. And that is, I think, is a danger. So that is the danger is when people choose what they prefer to say, what they think is irrelevant. The other is perhaps the most successful space treaty, in my view, is the ITU Constitution and Convention, which has been very effective in creating, a rule in space, particularly radio frequencies and orbital positions that have been done there. So there's a need to supplement these things. Now, the second point, very quickly, I want to say, it is not only important to have rules on the books, but it's also important that it must be interpreted, applied in good faith. Law often said that is binding, so you're bound by that. To me, one has to go beyond that. There's a moral imperative. Law has to be negotiated in good faith, interpreted in good faith, and applied in good faith. And that point, I think, started withering away. As I said earlier, some people or states are saying there are only 4 treaties. Okay, they forget the other one. And also the interpretation is changing because people do not look at the negotiating history. They interpret the treaty because as if it should have been rather than what the treaty is. I can give you a lot of examples. I think that is where the danger is, that particularly with respect to natural resources, all these mineral things like, there's a new interpretation, innovative interpretation, which is not in accordance with the law. And Joe mentioned earlier, my institute we are developing a kind of manual looking at what the law is, looking purely from the neutral, objective point of view. We're not reading it from American perspective or Canadian perspective. I think that will clarify the law. It's a very important. And the last point I will say that there's a lot of rumors, people, I will say, statements made which are wrong. you see somebody, very powerful person making, oh, international law does not apply to Mars. Hey, this is, to me, is irresponsible statement, right? Secondly, think there's a wild, wild west. Outer space is wild, wild west. That is absolutely wrong. There's international treaties, international laws are applicable. Simply that point here is you're trying to ignore that there are no rules. That is wrong things. So it's very important to understand their rules must be followed. They must be supplemented because the things are valid. Now, after 79, international community has not reached any agreement. That's wrong thing, because more sophisticated technologies become, more actions come in, you need more rules. Again, I bring to the point, we need that with respect to the use of space debris, for example, to control that, with respect to weaponization of space, conflicts in space, and more importantly, to cement, to concretize cooperation. Verbal cooperation need to be put in rules and regulation with respect, so that everybody can retain, can play according to the rules and take benefit of this new environment which we are having. So the rule of law must be respected, must be updated and followed that way. There's no point having law if you don't follow. So it's extremely important. So I can give the example, but I think we'll get to the question and answers.
I think, yes, thank you very much.
I would like to add just one point that
Very briefly, because we need to.
Okay, the thing that has changed is that when those first agreements were negotiated within the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, it basically was the U.S. and Soviet Union that agreed, and the other participants went along. But now the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space has grown to 100 countries, and they have to get unanimous agreement. And that change in the participants who are involved in making new space treaties is a fundamental shift, and it becomes so much harder to have China and Cuba and Venezuela on one side and the US and Europe on the other trying to reach agreement. There are processes that do work. There is a working group on the long-term sustainability of space that agreed on 22 new concepts of how to move forward, but it is very, very difficult.
Betty, I want to 20 seconds just to see
no, we need to move on.
Sure. Okay, that's fine. Okay.
Yes, I think it's best that we move on. Because these are the questions you said you wanted to talk. So we need to we have so much to cover, and I can see already you could just take one of the questions and really spend a good time. Carolin, this is for you, Dr. Freuh, or Professor Freuh. This really is addressing your area of specialty, the explosion of activity in space, especially commercial new space activities, that is projected by Merrill Lynch to be a multi-trillion-dollar industry, seems to be perhaps polluting near Earth orbit and creating runaway orbital pollution, known as the Kessler syndrome. We would not be familiar with that. So if we can stick to terms we know, that would create a torrent of debris that might even deny us safe access to space in coming years. What can be done to address the space debris problem?
Oh, thank you. And I'm just sharing kind of a bit of a video that my group has created. That's data from the 18th Space Command. This is all the objects we are tracking at the moment. All the dots is one object. And just to keep in mind, 97% of those objects, of the object numbers, are space debris and not active spacecraft. Only 3% are active spacecraft in that environment. That's the environment we're living in. And that is also the environment in which new space is acting. We would have a different picture if new space was coming into a region where no debris was already there, but we are kind of putting new space in, especially here, what you see close to Earth, the low Earth region, where we already have a lot of spacefaring going on. Focusing on some of the new space actors. Here I just have one that's actually kind of over a year old, but that is just Starlink by themselves, 1 dot for every Starlink at that time. And that's just one of the constellations. If you see, even in those constellations, you see a ton of objects already that are flying around. So that is the situation we are in. And if we're looking at how it has evolved in the number of launches, we see, as you refer to, Betty, that pickup in commercial launches, especially in the low Earth region between 200 kilometers and 1,700 kilometers altitudes. So the problem then there is that we are reaching kind of, and I want to jump to this one, a problem of density. We see here the height, and then here we see the years, and then we see, okay, there has been a lot of objects around, and then as in recent year, we are especially packing objects in that 450 to 650 kilometer height region where kind of the new big constellations are located. And the concern is then, well, are we getting too dense? That's kind of relating to that term Kessler syndrome, which is actually a very old term. There have been newer measures about critical densities, which are much more refined. But the question is, if we're too dense, objects are crashing into each other, creating clouds of new objects. We're hitting a point of actually being prohibitive for spacefaring from a physical point of view. Before we even hit that, we hit that from a commercial point of view. When my lifetime of the satellites are decreased, just because by the constant flux of small debris, even hitting and decreasing the lifetime of the solar panels, we're reaching, even before hitting kind of the physical limit, we're hitting the economical limit of what the space can sustain. So that's the situation we're in. And in that hype that we have new space economy and new things that are possible, we're actually hitting a limit of how many objects can we pack, because the relative velocities of those objects are very fast, several kilometers per second. That means they can crash into each other faster than a bullet leaves a handgun, for example. So that's the situation we are in. You can also compare that to what NASA is doing at the moment. NASA is having in the recent years just an uptick on how many collision avoidance maneuvers they have to fly, how hard they have to work with other space actors to keep the active spacecrafts active. And this is just a tremendous uptick, and per se that is not sustainable. And we're seeing even that then Europe now says, well, we have the Starlinks, they are setting the stage. We also want to have our communication system, which is very understandable from a political point of view, but is of course the wrong sign from a space debris perspective and from a space sustainability perspective. We have recommendations in place what to do after end of life, to deorbit your satellite so it burns up in the atmosphere. This is not binding at the moment. There are no repercussions if you don't comply. And what we are seeing with that uptick in spacefaring, that those are not sufficient anymore. We thought, okay, 25 years end of life, that's sufficient. We are not seeing that. With that many more objects, we have to be a lot more rapid what we do end of life, and how we are taking space debris considerations as part of our mission concepts into account. There's a lot more to say. I will stop here.
I know. There is a lot more to say with each of these questions. There are at least 2, maybe 3 questions that the panel and I had agreed on what questions we were going to ask at the beginning. There are 2 or 3 I do want to get to before we open it up to the, so I'm going to maybe merge a couple and just dive into the last couple that I really want to see addressed. And I'm going to ask if we could just sort of keep the answers a little more briefer so that we can get to them and get to, because there's so much that can be discussed about this. I'm going to bring it down to earth a little bit. I'm trying to see which one I want to answer first. Joe, just very briefly, you've been a friend for so long. Dr. Pelton, if you could just very briefly, we talked about the debris, the problem in the outer space. We talked about possible warfare, and if we can't have peace on Earth, can we have peace in the universe? And we talked about medicines being a wonderful research. What about how is this going to aid developing countries?
Okay, well, there are, of course, many satellites being launched in constellations by SpaceX and by Amazon and Facebook. And basically, we've seen the computer world mesh together with the space world to create these ideas of bringing new services to the developing countries, low-cost communications. This all started with a man named Gayweiler, who was trying to bring communications to Rwanda, and he could not get an economic model that worked. And then suddenly he said, aha, I can launch a constellation of low Earth orbit satellites to cover all of the countries of the world that are not served. And he created a system called O3B, and that stood for the other 3 billion people who are unserved. And he put up this system together with other companies, and that succeeded. And then he had a next idea. Instead of a constellation of medium Earth orbit satellites, he had the idea of launching 1,000 satellites in low Earth orbit called the OneWeb. And that moved ahead and is being deployed now. And now he has moved on to a new system called eSpace. And his first application is to launch 100,000 satellites. And these are very, very small satellites, and they say they have ways to avoid collisions. But there was a Rwanda filing now for 327,000 satellites. There is an application by China for 13,000 satellites. SpaceX is planning to put up 12,500 satellites, and they have already put up thousands of these satellites. Last year, we had 1,750 small satellites. Next year, we may have 6,000, and it keeps going up. And so on one hand, these systems are to bring low-cost communications for education and healthcare in developing countries. And the idea is a good one, but we're getting too much of a good thing, that we need to have only a few of these constellations to bring low-cost communications. We do not need space debris. That's not only the problem of collisions in space, but also now we're having problems that there's so much reflected light back from these constellations that astronomers are not being able to see the universe. And we're having light pollution in addition to all of these other collisions. The final thing I would say is that there's a company called Aerospace Corporation that works for the Air Force, and they've done a modeling of the 5 largest constellations. And in each one of these simulations, they see at deployment or at deorbit that there is a chance of at least 1 collision for each one of these constellations. And each time we have a major collision, it generates like 3,000 new debris elements. So what Carolin has told us is coming true, and we really need to do something different to change.
Thank you. I'm going to take, in the interest of time here, I'm going to take, because we are seeing several questions come in, and people are always so anxious to ask the questions. I just looked at them, and some of them are going to be interesting, and you'll want to answer them as well. You really will. So I'm going to take the last 2 and combine them. The one question that you wanted to address, I'm going to ask each of you to address it, and again, just briefly. Think about what you see as major developments in space over the next decade, which is only 10 years, but lots can happen, and your biggest concerns. And I want you to sort of think about that with the commercialization we've talked about. For years, space was a domain of space agencies and military services, and now we're including the commercial interests, what you call the private space industry, about a $500 billion related expenditures. And we've got the SpaceX and Blue Origin and what have you. producing new spacecraft and launches that are lower in cost, produce more quickly, and they claim perhaps even safer than the current NASA and European Space Agency. Is this true? And how does this again go back to what you see as the major developments we can look forward to in the space and your biggest concerns? And I want each of you to be able to address this, and again, just briefly, because we've got questions coming in and people are anxious to ask you. So Professor Jakhu, we'll start with you.
All right, thank you. My major concern, which keeps me awake at night, is the weaponization of space, use of space, space wars, all sort of thing. This is not science fiction. Different countries are developing weapons. There's no doubt about it. They are testing weapons, and Carolin mentioned already ASAT test being conducted, and that is going to be extremely dangerous, devastating, not only what is in space, but also on Earth. So that is, I think, is we should be everybody concerned. So what we need to do is have some kind of agreement among the nations saying that they will not use force in space. And also they should be banned on kinetic anti-satellite systems. So the kind of the test we have seen with Russia, China, or India, or earlier Americans, and they're doing it. That should be stopped, banned totally. No use of weapon, no test of weapons, no debris, particularly with that thing. So this is to me, stop weaponization of space.
Thank you. Professor Freuh.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I think what we see in the revolution in space, that has been intimately tied to the CubeSat revolution, that we can build smaller satellites which are kind of in a standard configuration, and that allowed us to do so much more. But then, well, that also creates a lot more of those problems. What I see is, I think we will see a lot more also commercial missions in more the lunar region. At the moment, everything is kind of focused on the low Earth orbit. I think that will expand, and that will only exacerbate some of the problems as we're clogging up other regions of space. In terms of the weaponization of space, with the space debris, we have to have a solution, end of life, bringing things down. In that wake, we're also creating active debris removal, where we have missions that is collecting debris. At the moment, we also only have LSAT that does it, the Japanese mission, but we'll see that more. In light of the weaponization of space, that is also a very powerful weapon. If I can grab an object which is non-cooperative to kind of put it out of its orbit, then I can do that also with with an active satellite, with a GPS satellite, for example, or something. So I think while I think we need to address the problem of space debris, it's a two-edged sword, and we have to be clear about that.
I was going to ask, couldn't these things just disintegrate into dust, like our bodies become dust? But yeah, you're right. I mean, you could do that against your enemy. Dr. Pelton.
Well, I've written a book called Space Systems and Sustainability. And in that book, I have said it's really great that the space agencies of the world are doing the exploration of space. We have these magnificent things like the new Webb telescope that will show us back to the start of time and so on. But we have all of these urgent problems that I feel it's imperative that the space agencies of the world work together and address. And there are major problems. Obviously, orbital space debris. Obviously, though, what we didn't talk about, we have problems with major solar storms. And about every 150 years, there is something called a coronal mass ejection, which can hit Earth in such a way that it does very bad things. The last one we had was in 1859, and when that so-called Carrington event occurred, it hit the telegraph systems. Telegraph offices caught on fire. and the Northern Lights came down to Cuba and Hawaii. If that same event were to happen today, it will probably wipe out the world's electric grids. It may disable our pipelines. It may do a whole lot of other damages that are really devastating to global society. There was a study done by Lloyd's of London that suggested that it would take $3 trillion, not 3 billion, $3 trillion to restore the electrical grid in North America. My idea is to have all the space agencies to come together. There's already a committee that's looking at issues like solar weather and space debris, but have it to look at all the problems of the world, whether we're talking about using space to combat global warming and climate change, or whether to use space systems to address pandemics, or to address asteroid strikes or solar storms, to get together and say, these are really big problems. These are mass extinction events that we should be using our space technologies together to work together to solve these problems. So that is my idea, that we need the space agencies to work together to address survival of our planet in terms of the threats to our modern society, threats from COVID-19, and all of these other threats, to say, how can we work together to address these survival issues?
Oh, I take a deep breath on that, thinking, can we just go back to Buck Roger days? It's just so much simpler. Yeah, pardon me?
It was simpler then.
Oh, it was so much simpler. Yeah. And to think 2001, how scared us.
Right.
I want to introduce Dr. Ray Montano. He's on our committee, the Great Decisions Committee, and we're now going to open this up to your questions. Again, please send your questions to Ray, not to everybody, but to Ray. It doesn't matter if everybody sees it, but Ray would like to see them. And also, again, we encourage you to please ask your own. And I want to say earlier that we would normally have just recorded this with just the panelists and myself, but we had a tech issue. And so we're just all here together in the audience, which is just fine. So Ray.
Sure, thank you very much, Betty. Very interesting comments we've had so far. Some of the questions that folks have raised, one kind of relates back to this whole issue of weaponization of space. And recently the United States has established something they call the Space Force. And so we're kind of, the question was really, what do you see as the responsibilities of this organization? And is this something we really need?
Ram, you should start.
Okay. I don't think you need force. I don't think Space Force should be, I mean, if US has initiated and other countries are following that. You know, these are defense forces, but they are, more importantly, they are offense forces also. So the question is to minimize or eliminate tensions and conflicts. And that can be done at the point of saying cooperation, and that is what is there. Now, once you establish something, then that institution has to justify its own existence. So if there are no problems, they start inventing the problems and then spending more money to solving them or preparing for that. So idea is, personally, I don't think this is a good idea to have space forces. I'm not concentrating only on US, other space forces. I think that is what is done.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, I slightly disagree on that. I mean, I do a lot of work with the DoD, and for me, just parts that have been in the Air Force have been moved to the Space Force. So we're not seeing kind of that. I mean, the Air Force has been tracking the space objects, for example. They have been sending out the collisions avoidance messages. So I sometimes think that the change that we're seeing is not as significant as it kind of sounds, that now we have a Space Force, and before that we didn't have the armed forces involved in that domain. Unfortunately, I think nowadays we cannot ignore space when we are thinking about the security of our country, unfortunately.
Mhm.
I would just like to add that people think about space wars or they think about wars on the ground, but increasingly in the world of counter space activities and asymmetrical attacks and so on, it looks as if that in the future we will see wars where things will be happening in space, things will be happening on the ground, and they will be integrated attacks. So there will be cyber attacks on banks on the ground and on satellites in the sky. And there will be, if you will, various ways to, if you will, target systems like the GPS system that's used for many things for our everyday lives, but it's also used for targeting missiles. And I just got a request from a friend in Latvia that they are concerned about the Soviets using their Glasnost system for targeting in Ukraine and what can be done to address that issue. So space wars, it involves here on Earth as well, and particularly with attack modes involving cyber and all sorts of other things. It's an integrated approach to attacking in space and on the ground.
Thank you. I had another question here to expand more on this commercialization of space. Is there any regulation possible? I mean, these private companies, SpaceX and so forth, to what extent are we able, through government regulation and to manage these companies that want to put up thousands of satellites?
Well, I'll start with this. Ram earlier said the ITU convention was been very successful in many ways, but the one way that it's unsuccessful is that it has a process where governments file for systems and they go through a procedure and then those systems are put up. There are no controls that say, hey, there are too many satellites going up. There is no space cop that says we have too many satellites, don't file for any more satellites. And as I say, this latest absurd filing for 327,000 satellites from Rwanda, I hope is not a nightmarish vision of the future. But the point is, one of the things that if we got all the space agencies together might be to say, hey, these are some of the rules of the road we need for the future, and that we need to put limits on the number of satellites being launched, and also limits on how you deorbit the satellites to clean up the skies. We have pollution here on Earth and problems with global warming. We have the same kind of issue in space of we're polluting space and putting up way too much mass into space. And particularly 45% of it is in low Earth orbit, which is the most crowded area.
Rick, can I add 30 seconds on that?
Sure.
Joe is right with respect to ITU, but I think we should keep in mind that ITU does not, does not regulate. Who regulates is FCC, Federal Communication Commission. It's a Federal Communication Commission which had the tap on that. It's a Federal Communication Commission should decide, like other regulatory agencies in the world, say you are not allowed to launch that many satellites, right? ITU simply take the information from United States and register. So I think this is what I'm saying. So we have to see who is really actually regulating that. And no company can launch a satellite without a license from FCC. So FCC should, in my view, should do that. Now I'm saying FCCs around the world. They should be the one who should be controlling that.
Well, let me just add that there is another problem, and these are what are called flags of convenience satellites, that sometimes people said, hey, the FCC approval was too slow. So they go to countries like Papua New Guinea or to some of the offshore islands to get them to file at the ITU. So even if we could get the FCC corrected, we have all of these other problems of flag of convenience filings that are starting to happen as well.
Like the Cayman Island banking system.
Yes.
Another question was about the ISS being abandoned. You know, what is the kind of the future of that? Is there parts of it are salvageable, or is the whole thing lost?
Well, unfortunately, the International Space Station was designed as a whole system. It was not designed in a modular way, that it could have been designed so that some of the, like the solar arrays, the solar cell arrays could be taken off and used for other purposes or what have you. But right now, the current plan is that in 2030, the space station is to be crashed down into an isolated part of the Pacific. The US has spent $140 billion over the years to put that up, and Europeans and others have invested probably another $50 billion or more. So it was not conceived in the best way possible. It is interesting, the Mir space station by Russia was a modular system, but again, they put it together in such a way that you couldn't disassemble it and take it apart. And that too had to be crashed down in, I think it was 2001.
In the context of cooperation and competition, I think ISS is an excellent example. It was made successful because of the cooperation, particularly after the fall of Soviet Union. It has become the symbol of brilliant international cooperation. Now it is becoming the victim of the conflict. So that is why it is important to have a cooperation which can last long, and countries should work together, cooperation rather than the competition.
Do we need a new one? Do we need a replacement?
Well, we are, but the interesting thing is what NASA is concentrating on right now is replacing it with a private space station, or maybe two. They are right now, they've made 3 awards quite recently. One is to Northrop Grumman and its partnerships. One is to Blue Origin, which is Jeff Bezos' Amazon company and partners, as well as a lesser known group, NanoRacks, and in partnership with, I believe it's Lockheed Martin. So those all 3 have put together proposals that NASA has funded with the idea that they would be putting up private Earth stations. There's another group which NASA's already funded and working with, called Axiom, that also is planning to put up a private space station. And their idea is that private companies can do this more cost effectively. But the bottom line is, yes, NASA needs the space station. Russia and China are working together to deploy their own space station that they plan to have up as early as maybe 2025. And China, of course, has its so-called Tiangong 3 space station that it's halfway deployed and will have fully deployed shortly. So there are lots of reasons why you need them for missions to the moon and to Mars and what have you. But right now, NASA's idea is to have more, perhaps 1 or more private space stations that they can use for staging and doing experiments in space.
Yeah, I think it's also natural that NASA also moves the focus further out. We have many years of experience in the low Earth region with the experiments, and I think it's also natural that that moves also in the direction of space tourism and allowing that, making that more easily, and then that the next focus is further out, like the gateway or the platforms where we then look back to, going back to the moon or to the manned Mars mission and these things. So I think it's also, I think it also has run its course to a certain extent, that I think it's the task of the space agency to also, make the next step.
I'm kind of a science fiction buff, and commercial space endeavors always went badly in science fiction. Is there a concern with this?
Well, the number one concern is, of course, the space debris and too much stuff going up. And so it's interesting, the people who are deploying these systems, they have said this old idea of 25 years and then you deorbit is way out of fashion, and that they want at the end of life immediate removal from space, because they see the danger to their own investments. But right now, people are over concerned with putting up too much space and too little of activity to take it down. There is a group called Astroscale from Japan that is showing new technologies to take it down. There's a McDonald Gayweiler company in Canada who's also developing that technology, and there are other experiments that have been done recently with how you can use different technologies to bring the space debris down. But we are way behind the curve in that area, as Carolin has pointed out so well.
Yeah, and I think also, I think this is not only a space problem, but if you have industry and corporations without the legislative framework or without the regulations, then this probably always goes badly, not only in space.
Absolutely. Ray, I was wondering if I can make a comment on Joe's comment earlier when he was responding to the first question. Very shortly, I think he raised a very important point with respect to regulations. He is absolutely right. The treaties were essentially written by major space powers in 70s. I think what we always forget, other nations joined, trusted those countries who negotiated those treaties. Okay. Now let me see. I don't know whether you heard the statement by delegate of Kenya to the Security Council the last 2 days or so. And he made the statement in the Security Council that these countries, developing countries or other countries, joined United Nations when the charter was already adopted by major powers at that time. Those countries trusted these countries or major space powers. They made, at least 5 of them maintained veto. Now, what he said, that there is a downfall to multilateralism, and these major countries, these 5 countries, are abusing their power. And so there's a downfall, there's a neglect to multilateralism. I think that example very much lies with what you see, the major problems in the world today. 1 or 2 countries having veto are involved in wars around the world. So if you take that in case of space, for example, and Joe is right, this treaty, the Outer Space Treaty, was drafted mainly by Soviet Union and the United States, and of course the other countries, UK and France and that sort of thing. What is happening in now, if you see the I think clever interpretation, I will say wrong interpretation of the treaties is coming not from the countries who joined these treaties. They are the ones who do not want to negotiate new treaties. They do not want to supplement the regulatory regime which was there. They are not interested in kind of following the obligation they have undertaken. The UN is not the only forum where international law is being made, can be made. 1963 treaty was drafted outside the UN, very successful treaty. And the treaty which prohibits the use of environmental modification for military purposes, very successful treaty, was outside the United Nations. International Space Station was outside the United Nations system. So it's a lack of will, I will say, if I dare to say, lack of will on the major space powers not to develop space law. And they are one. If they, for example, if 5 countries, these major countries, come into agreement, draft a treaty, I can say overnight other countries will join it. So I think it's somewhat not accurate to say that COPS is not effective. There's a difficult to reach consensus. You do not need COPS for development of the treaties. What you need, the willpower of the 5 major powers. And here I will say, if you have power, you have a responsibility. Power and responsibility must go hand in hand. So that is, to me, that is the fault lies downfall of multilateralism. There's a rise of unilateralism. And that is, I think, is the major cause of the problem. And whatever the problems that they can be solved with cooperation concretized in international treaties.
All right, thank you. I had to kind of change gears a little bit here. Deborah Myers asked about Earth-based telescopes. How is all this space debris and so forth affecting kind of Earth-based space exploration?
Yeah, in order to track and detect the space debris in high altitude orbits, I'm also using a telescope, and the Space Force is using telescopes in other countries. So that has always been a mean. So all the space objects are reflective to a certain degree, and if the angle is right, you can see that. What has changed is that the Starlinks, especially the first and second generation, seem to be very, very bright. I mean, you could see those trains of the Starlinks by the naked eye, and beforehand you could only see the ISS with the naked eye. And so that has changed. With that, because they are bright and because there are many, several thousands, as we know, that is affecting ground-based astronomy. Just because you constantly, you're kind of looking at the stars, the satellites are moving relative to the stars, so you're constantly getting streaks across. That, again, that problem has been known before. What astronomers usually do is kind of they stack several images together and then the streaks are averaged out. However, as with everything, there's a limit to it. If the satellites are very bright and especially in low Earth orbit, they're also relatively fast, so they make a long streak across your image, they can really destroy your imagery. It also should be noted that SpaceX has reacted. That was just a function of the shape of their satellites and kind of the special painting that they used, has reacted. The new generation is less bright. So I think there are things to be done there to mitigate at least the super bright kind of Starlinks. Mm-hmm. However, as we are sending more objects, even the fainter ones, the more streaks you're getting, the more that is affecting. And I think the astronomy community is very powerful. There have been several motions inside the Astronautical Union and other entities to make push. In a certain sense, it is a lost battle kind of against all light pollution. All cities provide light pollution. So it's just kind of mitigating the effects, but it's an uphill battle.
The problem is not just the light, though. There's also, it started with the Iridium satellite system interfering with radio telescopes. But now with more and more satellites and more frequency being used, there's increasing problems with radio telescopes being majorly interfered due to the radio signals from the satellites as well.
Thank you. Betty, do you have a question you want to ask?
Yes, mine is so simple compared to some of the meatier questions. now we're going to go back now to past Buck Rogers at least, but more in the beginning where we talked about we were going to make the universe, our exploration of the universe, a peaceful pursuit. And I remember the time, and I was young. I would have been too young to be cynical, but I thought, we don't have peace on Earth. How are we going to have it in the universe? And of course, we were thinking of Russia and the U.S. This was during the Cold War. And I knew when we planted that American flag on the moon that this was just going to cause trouble because other countries would want to plant their flag there too. Was it realistic of us to think? And we've talked about the need for a rule of law, which is an expression we understand on Earth, but we're now trying to apply it to the universe. Was it realistic to think that we can actually have this this interplay in this vast space? Was it realistic to begin with? And I know you probably have said this. I think Joe may have said it. When can we actually pinpoint when the friction began, when we played the attempt at getting along nicely, but it kind of began to fall apart? But were we realistic to even think this was possible? And when did that real friction start?
Well,
let me start with,
go ahead.
sorry, Joe, you want? Okay, Betty, I think that's a brilliant question. To me, it was realistic, very much realistic. Just imagine what was happening in from 57 to 63 or 67. That was a really height of Cold War. You just imagine that we did not have outer space treaty at that time. Realistically, we do not have the treaty. Both the Soviet Union and the United States would have gone the path of Cold War in space. I think that was realistic at that time. And that is why it worked very well. Till very recently, people started questioning because of the other reason. It was realistic at that time. And second thing, when we talk about space law is not for extraterrestrial. It does not apply to space. It doesn't apply to moon. It doesn't apply to anything. It applies to humans' activities in space. So the law has to be governing our activities on Earth and in space. So to me, it's very realistic. Why it is perceived not to be working? Because we don't trust each other, because we stop respecting law. And I think that is what it is. So and secondly, we are all mainly talking about space law or treaties, probably in no space beyond moon. Everything is there. We are not talking about galaxies and all that because we are not going there. So we are talking about human activities, low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, and that. So to me, it's realistic. Okay, the question has to see whether is a dream or anything. I think dream is always important. Space fiction is the mother of space fact. So fiction, the idealism is very important because that will survive us to do that. Just imagine if it is not realistic, what will happen? You will see all these missiles flying around in space, be killing each other, destroying every material. It is our question of humanity's survival. It's sustainability. If it is not realistic, we have to make it realistic because it is what is needed. We cannot live without law on the ground. We certainly cannot live law in space. So that is my take on that.
Let me just add a couple of points. One of the problems is like the ITU, which regulates orbital locations and frequencies, doesn't have police that can go and give tickets or put people in jail. And that this is a problem that the only international organization that can levy fines today is the World Trade Organization. So as we go forward, it will be necessary to have really strict enforcement capabilities developed. And that's one of the things that I would like to see through alliance of the space agencies to try to figure out, where can we move ahead to have stricter regulations. But let me put a positive spin on things. There is a former student of Rom, a good friend of mine, who went off and created a new organization called For All Moonkind. And the idea is that just as UNESCO has sites that it protects on Earth, it is trying to protect the original landing sites where Neil Armstrong got down, incidentally, a Purdue graduate from years back. Anyway, the idea is to start thinking about, are there areas of the moon, and for that matter, even Mars, that needs to be protected? And can we create some sort of a process to start creating parks and areas to protect off-world? So maybe that's at least one hopeful note to end on.
All right.
Carolyn, did you want to add to that?
Not really. I think it was unrealistic from the start, but as any human enterprise, we have to struggle through and find ways of limiting abuse and preserving that precious resource of space that we have.
I do, Ray, if there's no more, are there more?
No, I got two more questions.
Okay, then I have a final question I want to ask that I think will be a real fun one of these panelists. So go ahead.
Okay, so this is really for Carolyn, I think. Can important satellites be hardened? Is there a way to, like, I hate to use the word shields around satellites, but is there a technology that's in development for that kind of thing?
Yeah, there have been quite some technology developments, and they are indeed called shields. Sorry for the name.
That's right. I love it.
Yeah. So first of all, the surface of the satellites has been redesigned to have what's called those Whipple shields. It's not just one surface, but you have kind of more like a structure which has several layers, and then small pieces can kind of penetrate the first layer, and then kind of basically become kind of a plasma cloud going over a larger cross-sectional area, doing less damage. So that has been developed as also a light material. The ISS has a bunch of shielding. I mean, classical shielding just to protect its vital parts. And so yes, it can be done. Then it's always the question of cost. It's launch cost. Every gram, every kilogram is launch cost. The lighter you can make it, the better. And that's where those two things collide. And that's also where I think the kind of the economic threshold of what we can fly is kind of, with the larger amount of debris, becoming prohibitive at some point, because yes, you can make the shielding, and yes, we have technology, but it costs. And it's always, yeah, I mean, you cannot, or you can launch a tank, but that would be so much launch mass that yeah, that's just prohibitive from kind of a cost perspective in that sense. The other challenge is shielding is always effective for a certain size range. I mean, if a full satellite hits your satellite, no shielding will protect you. That's kind of a head-on collision of several kilometers per second. So the shielding is for kind of small, medium-sized objects. There it can be effective, but it's costly.
Kind of a second part of it.
Just to add, Ray, a couple of points of that.
Sure.
There's three things to protect against. The one, orbital space debris. The other one is radiation from the sun, and that can knock out a satellite. And also there is a lot of meteorites and so on. People don't realize that we gain about 60 tons or so of stardust and meteorites and stuff to the Earth every week. So we're constantly being bombarded. So there's natural debris, orbital space debris, and radiation that satellites have to contend with.
Yeah, exactly. On the natural debris, kind of the micrometeoroids, the sad truth is we have outnumbered that with the human-made debris of that size and now, unfortunately.
So a second part of that question I had then is that all this technology seems so fragmented in that we're putting up tens of thousands of satellites. Is there any sort of work movement to kind of create more multifunction kind of satellites so you can combine a number of functions into one piece rather than put up 10,000 satellites, put up 50 that do a lot of things.
Yeah, the trend is rather the opposite.
Right.
We had the big birds, but then you have a single point of failure. And we actually moved away from that rather than having 10, 20, 50, or 100 kind of in a networking way doing the same task, just because it's more resilient. I can lose 1, 2, 3 of 100 and still accomplish that task. So paradoxically enough, it has moved the opposite direction, just from a resilient point of view, from an economic point of view, from a space debris point of view. It's much easier to keep track of one big piece than, I don't know, a gazillion of smaller pieces.
However, that's not really what's causing the problem. That it's not a matter of the function, it's a matter of the configuration, or what we call constellations. That Arthur C. Clarke's original idea was geosynchronous satellites that were out there almost a tenth of the way to the moon, that one of them could cover a third of the Earth, and that they were constant in their location, so you didn't have to track them with the antennas. But the problem is there was a tremendous delay associated with the transmission back and forth to geosynchronous orbit. And so all of these new systems that are being developed in low Earth orbit are to have very low latency, to respond to networking systems that internet doesn't like delays. And so the idea is 3 satellites can cover the Earth in geosynchronous orbit. About 18 can cover the Earth in medium Earth orbit, but you need a large number of them, 100 or so at least, to operate in low Earth orbit to cover the Earth. So it's that constellation to cover the Earth completely in low Earth orbit that's creating the need for all of these satellites and these large constellations.
I mean, I do not fully agree. I mean, when you say the GPS, I mean, it's only a handful. You could do it with fewer satellites. I mean, you're absolutely right. We need the coverage. You do not necessarily need a couple of thousands to accomplish it if you had bigger birds which were more capable. But of course, yes, you need more than 1, 2, or 10 for the global coverage.
Latency, and I was working with a group called Freuh that was going to do it with 100 really big satellites, which to me made a lot more sense. But anyway, it's a combination of functionality and also orbits to cover the Earth. Mm-hmm. And you need a lot more satellites for low Earth orbit coverage.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. Betty, you want to? That was all I had.
This will be the major question of the evening, and it doesn't require a discussion. It's just simply a question, because we are getting close to our time. And I'm cognizant that for those of you who are attending this evening, you really care about this topic a great deal. And you may also want to watch what's going back down here on Earth as we have the President's State of the Union address tonight, which, you know, they talk about the Earth. Here's an important question for you. I can put myself in the category of 2 of the panelists who are older. We have one panelist who's a younger person, younger professional. Would you go to Mars knowing that you probably couldn't come back to be a part? I mean, you've spent your life now on global exploration, and you've been fascinated with your work beyond belief. Would you volunteer to be a part of that colony, that permanent colony? I explained you'd eat well. I mean, you'd have lots of greens. Would you go?
Well, let me start with why I'm saying is because here at McGill University in Montreal, the scientists are developing a kind of system which will take you to Mars in 45 days. This is a revolutionary. I don't know. I checked it. It's not a fake news. And I think that time is going to come. People go faster to Mars. But I will not, Betty, please forgive me for saying that, but I don't think I'll go to colonize or to colony. No, I will go to settle there. I think there's there's a very serious difference between colonization and settling.
Amen.
I think this is what is a more important thing in that way. So, okay, I reveal my age. I'm 76. I'm fit and nice. I will go. Why not?
I thank you. Thank you for the correction. I'm surprised I used the word because it came up before. Not colon, because I wasn't even thinking of how we used to use that horrible word colonizing, but be a part of a community,
Exactly.
settling community. So you would go.
Absolutely.
Okay, Joe, we would have no more bears, you understand.
Well, first of all, I'm reminded of a talk where I was with Elon Musk, and he said he wanted to end his life on Mars, but not on landing, which is a real Elon Musk perspective. I had a chance to be a onboard technician on a shuttle launch when I was at Intelsat, and we were deploying satellites before the Challenger accident. Of course, the Challenger accident ended all of those commercial missions on the space shuttle. And I think that was my one shot at maybe doing space travel. So I really do think that we need to think very carefully about Mars and how we would do it. I have this idea of creating a space shield for Mars that would block the solar wind that strips off the atmosphere of Mars. And if we deployed such a shield in maybe 50 to 60 years, Mars would develop a natural atmosphere and perhaps even a breathable atmosphere. And I think that is the time after we do something really outlandish, but maybe very pragmatic, that we consider really going to Mars in a significant way. And I'm afraid that's beyond my lifespan.
So you're not volunteering, okay.
I'm not volunteering.
Carolin, well, once you have grandkids too, you definitely don't want to leave Earth. Carolin.
Yeah, no way. It was never, I mean, I like space, I like the research there. It was never something that tempted me on actually doing space tourism or spacefaring, or let alone go to Mars. Just not who I am.
Well, it's a fun discussion to have with people who are working with this to kind of get different answers. And I'm too claustrophobic. I freak out in an elevator, so I don't think I would do well going to Mars. Well, listen, thank you all very much. It was a deep discussion. I think you brought up, each of you, some incredible points that honestly, I don't think many of us thought about. We've been captivated by one launch after the other. And I don't think we thought a lot about the debris, the dangerous potential of the debris, the discussion of mutuality in the universe. And we really only can touch the surface of what we know, because we know it's just so vast and beyond our scope. And so you've got good sports to talk about the Mars question, but thank you so much. It gives us a lot to think about. Are students still excited? Are they still wanting to get in? Do you find, Carolyn, you would probably know this more being at the university, and also Ram, are students still joining up and wanting to major in this and explore? Is the excitement for space among young people still there as it was when John Kennedy wanted us to go to the moon? Do you see it?
Well, in our program, we offer a space law, air and space law. There's a lot of interest in space law nowadays. Earlier it was air law, but more space law. We are getting for master's degree, we have PhD degree, postdocs. So they are very excited about it. Our program is, we are celebrating a 70th anniversary of the Institute, and we got a very good applications on that. So people are upbeat for, at least in space law. That's the field I am in.
So the imagination and the fire is still there. That's good to hear.
Absolutely.
Betty, I'd like to make a final point of that. We've talked about so many of the problems and things that could go wrong in space, but when I was at Intelsat, I headed what was called Project SHARE, and that stood for Satellites for Health and Rural Education. And we did many projects giving away free space time. The first big project was for China. which started out with about 20 Earth stations to bring health and rural education to China. That program expanded to, I think, 78,000 Earth stations and up to 10 million students who were able in rural areas of China to get education and healthcare that they never got before. And that actually satellites are a major tool for education, for healthcare, for government services, for help to farmers, and to thousands of applications where space is bringing new capabilities to rural and remote parts of the world. It's we use the GPS system today for so many different things. So space can bring us problems, but it also can bring us magnificent new capabilities and abilities to serve underserved parts of the world. So we shouldn't forget that aspect.
And I think that's a really good note for us to leave on, is a positive note. I think some of us have seen how the benefits of medicine, for those of us who've had issues, and not personally, but where we know that the medicines that have brought us to better health have come from experiments in the space. I'm going to bring you back to Earth. Next week, we do come back to Earth, and please join us again next Tuesday. I invite our panelists to please join us next Tuesday. You now know how we do our programs. It's robust. We have Dr. Pierre Atlas joining us next Tuesday. He's going to be talking about Biden's agenda, and he's going to be focusing a lot on Ukraine. And we don't know what he's going to be saying, because this has been an explosive 6 days. Who knows what's going to take place over the next 7? So he could prepare his remarks tomorrow, knowing that he's going to probably have to change them Monday night. So things are very fluid right now in the universe and on Earth. Thank you for joining us. Please think about becoming a member. We love bringing these wonderful programs to you. My very special thank you to the 3 panelists. Carolin, I look forward to meeting you because we're in the same community. Ram, I'm sorry I won't be getting up to Canada, but I will get back out to DC. John, I look forward to that glass of beer, a glass of wine that we can have again. And to all of you, good night. Thank you for joining us. Come back again next Tuesday. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Betty, for having us.
Thank you.
And also, thank you, Joe and Ram. I learned a lot.
Learned a lot. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all.
Hey, I have a quick question while people are logging off. How did the Space University end up in Strasbourg, France?
It was a competition. The 3 finalists were in Japan, in Canada, in Montreal, or Toronto, or Strasbourg. And ultimately, we had a decision that we would go to Canada, but then the Canadian university said it would have to be a subpart of the university, and it could not keep its name, the International Space University, and that became a deal killer. And so it came back to Strasbourg, France, which frankly was a mistake, in that it should have been in Toulouse, which is where all of the space industry, the Canadian Space Agency is, and so on. But Strasbourg is a beautiful place, and we were very fortunate to have a partnership with the Institut Louis Pasteur, and so that has worked out. But it probably should have been either in Canada or it should have been in Toulouse. But that's the way it worked out.
Well, that's the headquarters of the European Parliament.
Yes, a magnificent, huge building built at enormous expense.
Yeah, I was just wondering if that had anything to do with it.
No. The decision to build the university came first.
Huh. So do they have actually a campus with students? And
Oh yes. The university is sort of at the research park where the university or Institute Louis Pasteur is.
uh-huh.
It's a very nice building. Go on to the website look for International Space University. You can see the building and the facilities there.
I was in Strasbourg just 2 years ago, so
So it's out of the heart of the city by about 8 miles.
yeah, okay. Cool. Well, thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. I think we're just waiting for our host to, is Danya still here?
No, she said she made me the host, but I don't really know how to end this. I could just,
I think I can end it, but why don't we just all hit end down there and say goodnight?
Yes.
Okay.
It was great seeing everyone. This was a great program. I knew nothing about this topic.
good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye all.
Bye.